Caution, this will involve religion and politics. Welcome to The Wandering Prodigal. Okay, this will probably age me, but welcome to The Wandering Prodigal. The time period is the 70s and the 80s. It's a time of political change, and religious change. It's when mainstream evangelicalism became more politically active. The early 80s, we saw the advent of the moral majority and their activeness for more control in politics, for ethics, and more of their idea of what is right and wrong. Churches were seeking more control over their congregants. More people were reporting that they were abused. The rules became really strict. I've heard of so many people who have actually reported that, such things, if they were setting foot into a bowling alley, they were not saved. If they were to touch their lips to a glass of wine, they were not saved. If there was smoke, they were not saved. They swore, they were not saved. So many of these issues that came up, LGBTQ and abortion, any of that stuff, you were not saved. But I want to take a look at my own life. My life was in around somewhat of evangelicalism, but I had it kind of easy as I started to reflect back at my own life over the last several months. Growing up, talking with my own sister about this, I came to realize that we weren't under a lot of the same rules that a lot of churchgoers were. My mom smoked, my dad drank, actually both my parents drank. Up to the day they died, I guess my dad really didn't drink until the day he died because they wouldn't allow it in the nursing home. But I know up until my mom died, both of them drank. My dad really liked his wine and his beer. And, that type of thing, that was the type of life I was around. But I started really realizing a lot of when I was growing up. My sister and I, we had a pretty normal life. We were born, both of us were born in California. We lived there through our early childhood. We never went to church. My parents still were religious, but it was a different type of religion. They called themselves Christians. But looking back at it, it was an odd sort. They belonged to one particular church. I don't even know what the denomination officially was, but they called themselves the Kingdom Movement. My dad's idea of evangelizing was to preach that we were the true Israelites, and he was always talking to the white evangelical, or the white person. It wasn't necessarily evangelical, but he was always witnessing to the white person, saying we were the true Israelite. Not even the Jews that we know back in Israel now, they weren't the true Israelites. And I never really thought about it. I remember growing up, we lived in Oregon for a number of years, and down in our basement, my dad had a whole collection of audio tapes. That really aged me there. Some of you may not even know what a cassette tape is. But there were recordings of a guy by the name of Richard Butler. If you're not familiar with him, he was one of the founders of the neo-Nazi movement. He was a white supremacist. And I never knew about it. Back as a kid, 8, 9, 10 years old. I didn't know about it. But, I used to sit down there. I would play those tapes pretending I was going to church. My sister and I started going to church regularly with friends when we moved to Oregon. we were still in our preteens. My sister was 2 years younger than me, and so this is where we started getting exposed to mainstream evangelicalism. But once we moved up to Washington State, where I'm at now, my parents started going to this particular church that they had been involved with even back before I was well born, and even before my parents even got married and met. It was where my dad was actually ordained as a minister. He was an ordained minister, and this is where he gained his kingdom movement ideals, I guess. I'm not exactly sure where he got them. The way my grandparents lived, because my grandfather was also an ordained minister, and he trained under the same people. But I don't know. Just thinking back on my grandparents, they seemed to be very loving people. I thought that they were always loving toward other races. But the one thing that I do remember about my dad is the ideals of staying away from blacks, especially Africans and African Americans. He was pretty respectful as far as what he called them, but I was never really exposed to them growing up. And so I kind of heard a lot of his message, but it never really sunk in. It wasn't until I got into my late teens and to my early adult years that this particular church that we were going to, most of the people there were pretty old. If you want to get any type of ideas, we had five of the members die in a 6-month period, including the head pastor. That's how old the members were. There was really no youth group. The youth were made up of my cousin, who is 6 years older than I am, my sister and I, and then there was another girl that was from another family that ultimately, my cousin married her, actually ultimately, I guess step-aunt, I guess is what she would have been classified as. So we all were just part of the same family. So my sister ultimately started going to another church before she graduated from high school, and I continued with the same church until after high school. I decided, you know what, I wanted to spread out. I need to start getting out to another church, hanging out with people more my age. And that's when I started going to the same church my sister was going to, and got involved with the college career group there. And that was my first experience going into mainstream evangelicalism. When they started hearing about the message that my dad, preached, which, because obviously I was preaching the same thing, they started really looking at me like, you got to be kidding me. That's not right. And so I started really thinking through that and started questioning that particular message. Well, about 2 years after I started going to this particular church, I decided I was going to go back to college, go back to school. And I started down at a Bible college in Portland. And I went through 4 years there thinking I wanted to go into full-time ministry. And that was where I became more solidified into the evangelical movement. I was ready to subject myself to the rules. I knew about the rules. And so, down at this college, you weren't allowed to dance. You weren't allowed to hug. You weren't allowed to kiss, especially on campus. If you're off campus, you're allowed to, kiss and hug. It just couldn't be in front of people, or else, I'd have a lot of private eyes going around there. But you weren't allowed to see rated R movies. If you saw a rated R movie, you were in big trouble. Any of these number of things. But I subjected myself to this. I was aware of these rules. I subjected to myself to these things. And I disciplined myself. I was called disciplined. Integrity was a huge word that was being thrown around that campus. So I went through 4 years of that, graduated, and started up working for a rental car company. And I continued working that, but it was not in ministry. Even to this day, I never did go into ministry full time. I was involved in late ministry, worked with youth groups, worked with the middle school group out at that particular church that I had gone to as a young adult, and going through a lot of changes. Again, I was subjecting myself to a lot of these rules and getting strongly involved with the mainstream evangelicalism. I gained a lot of these ideals. And as I went through the years, probably 20 plus years involved with it. And actually, it was about 25 years before I started really seeing some things and started questioning some things. But this was the primary focus of this particular video. This is part one. And I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about my early time, my early childhood, growing up into my young adult years, and moving up and changing through this radical white supremacist type nationalist movement up into the evangelical mainstream movement. And what I will be talking about going into my next video, part two of this, will be my movement beyond my mainstream evangelical movement. I am no longer involved in evangelicalism. I would actually not call myself a Christian. That is going to be coming up in part two. So thank you, and you guys have a great day. Bye.